Okay, so part two, guys. It's the middle of winter. We've got really long, dark, crystal clear nights, mostly crisp and dry. It's a great time to spend time outdoors and pay attention to what's going on with the stars at night. So rather than use apps and computer images and all that kind of stuff, I'm going to start with a photo I took last night. Now this is a GoPro shot, so it's wide angle. I apologize if you're squinting a little bit. This is, if you go outside and look at this for real, this is a huge amount of sky captured in this picture. But we should be able to use what you can see here to kind of walk through. The constellations that we know as the shapes and the creatures and all these mythical things that, don't really pop out at you, honestly. Astronomers use them differently. They're more like states. They're actually hard boundaries between regions of sky that define a constellation. An object, a planet, might one night be in Aquarius and the other night be in Pisces as it crosses that distinct line. For our purposes, what we're actually more concerned with is called an asterism, and that is the shapes that the stars make. And asterisms aren't necessarily limited to a particular constellation. So I'm going to show you two big ones in the winter sky, the Winter Hexagon and the Winter Triangle, that kind of leapfrog from constellation to constellation, and we'll go into each of those a little bit. So let's start off with the most recognizable constellation for most of us in the northern hemisphere, and that's Orion. Orion, the hunter, is the brightest constellation in terms of the average magnitude of all the stars that are in it, and it actually looks like what it represents. You got two shoulders, two knees, a very distinct three-star belt, and then a three-star sword hanging down below that belt. If you've got a really dark sky, you can also see a faint line out in front of Orion that some pictures represents a club, some it represents a bow. Either way, he's a hunter and facing to our right as we look at the sky. Two real prominent stars in that. Again, his right knee at our right as we're looking at it is a blue supergiant called Rigel. The left shoulder is Betelgeuse, spelled and pronounced just like the movie from the 80s, Beetlejuice. And I won't say it a third time. The middle star of the sword is actually not a star. It's the Great Orion Nebula. It's bright enough to see with the naked eye, but it is a cloud of illuminated gas and dust. And if you do a long-term exposure like this with a camera, you can see that it is a nebula, not a star. A small telescope will really make this pop too, although the colors are hard to discern. So here's how Hubble presents this, just so you know. So we'll start with Orion. Let's do the hexagon real quick. If you start with Rigel, the bright blue star in Orion's knee, you go down, you find Sirius. That's the brightest star in our sky. It's the dog star. It's in Canis Major. You go then up to Procyon. Procyon is the only bright star in Canis Minor, the small hunting dog. Procyon, by the way, means before the dog, and if you're out there where all this rises, when these stars are rising, Procyon comes up just a little bit before Sirius, unless you live in the tropics, and then they're right about the same, or maybe Sirius is even first. But for European latitudes, the Greeks and Babylonians, when all this was coming up, Procyon comes up just a little bit before. That's where it got its name. Continuing along from Procyon up to Pollux. There are actually two bright stars here. They're the heads of the Gemini twins, Castor and Pollux. Pollux is the brighter one. Go on up to Capella, which is straight up, almost, and a really bright, prominent star. Back down to Aldebaran. Aldebaran is a red supergiant that is in the cluster the Pleiades, which is part of Taurus. I'll get into all of that in a minute. And then close the loop back to Rigel. Giant hexagon in the sky. If you can pick out these bright stars, they are handholds to everything else that's going on. And oh, by the way, if we throw Betelgeuse into the mix, which is Orion's shoulder, you get this beautiful equilateral triangle right in the middle of the sky, and that's the Winter Triangle. So Winter Triangle, Winter Hexagon, again, just sort of handholds. So let's walk through the constellations. I already talked about Orion quite a bit, so let's jump down. Canis Major actually looks like a stick figure of a dog. He's the hunting dog of Orion. In my picture, I only caught his head. Sirius is kind of his shoulder. Just below the horizon here, you see a tail and a back leg. Not worth going into very much, other than Sirius is the brightest star in the sky, and that's where it is. Procyon and Canis Minor, the small hunting dog, is literally just these two stars. It's Procyon and the one next to it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that either. Going up here to Gemini, though. Gemini you might recognize is one of the zodiac constellations that lies across the ecliptic. And like we talked about before, it's about 30 degrees across. Castor and Pollux are the obvious things in Gemini that you're going to see, and those are the heads of the twins. And if you look real closely, it kind of resembles a stick figure pair holding hands, and then their feet go back towards Orion's head. Can you see it? Can you see it? Yeah, how about now? Yeah, it's not necessarily obvious. In a dark sky, it pops a little better. You know, again, this is the region of space occupied by Gemini, and those two, Castor and Pollux, the stars at their heads, that's really what you're keying into. And again, this hexagon kind of helps you do that. So going up to Capella. Capella is in the constellation Auriga. Auriga is the charioteer. It's a huge pentagon in the sky, and again, it's pretty much straight up these days. You'll notice that down below Capella, there's this little bump on the pentagon of a couple of spare stars. Those are called the kids, or sometimes the goat stars. Auriga is often pictured carrying a goat or baby goat in his arms, and those goats are like sacred goats that nursed a baby Zeus in mythology. So somehow Auriga as a charioteer wound up with them, and those are the goat stars. So whatever. Taurus. Taurus is obviously another zodiac constellation, and it's very recognizable by two things. Two of the closest open clusters to Earth are in Taurus. One of them is the V-shaped Pleiades, and there's a bright red star that's actually not part of the cluster. It's actually between us and the cluster, but Aldebaran is a red supergiant, and that marks Taurus's eye. I've always kind of grew up looking at that V shape as Taurus's horns, and that's an easy way to remember it, but the way they depict it, that's actually his face, and so that bright star is on one of Taurus's eyes, and the point is kind of at his nose. So back in Taurus's shoulder is this other beautiful open cluster called the Pleiades. You will often see it as the Seven Sisters. It's a good test of your vision and how clear the sky is. On a clear night and with good eyesight, you ought to be able to see 7 individual stars in this cluster. There's actually a heck of a lot more, but that's kind of the naked eye visibility. So the Pleiades are in Taurus's shoulder. Taurus can kind of be viewed as fighting Orion. So look, we've already learned a bunch of constellations. We've got Orion, Canis Major, Canis Minor, Gemini, Auriga, and Taurus. Gemini and Taurus, again, zodiac constellations, each of them about 30 degrees wide, right? Each of them taking up 2 hours to move past a given point. If you start to look at the sky and you can pick out those two, that should start to draw where is the ecliptic, where is the plane of the solar system, where's the sun going to be, where's the moon going to be, where are all the planets going to be. If I trace that line over here to the horizon, that's where the sun's going to come up because it's on the ecliptic in that plane. This is how that starts to become useful. And oh, by the way, we talked about Taurus, we talked about Gemini. Hope you can learn those. But by default, we learned Cancer. The zodiac is those stars that lie along the ecliptic. Some of those regions are pretty dark and obscure, but they've been sectioned off anyway. So these two, Gemini, Taurus, are pretty easily recognizable. Cancer, you're not going to be able to look at a chunk of sky and say, oh, well, that's Cancer. What you're going to be able to say is, oh, look, it's that big dark area that is to the east of Gemini. That's Cancer. And later you'll be able to say, oh, it's between Gemini and Leo. That's Cancer. You really know 3 of them, right? One of them's only by reference. But we'll continue this, but I encourage you to go out on one of these dark nights and kind of do this exercise. See if you can find the hexagon, see if you can walk through and identify all these constellations. In particular, see if you can't find the ecliptic. It's running above Orion's head from Gemini to Taurus and beyond. We'll continue to do this as the sky changes over the course of the year and again build up some knowledge. Hey, real quick thing, couple of things that are happening this week. Just if you wanted to know, on Tuesday, Venus is at conjunction. It means it's directly opposite the sun from us. Thursday, again, if you're a morning person, Jupiter and Mars aren't right next to each other anymore, but they're pretty close. And on Thursday, they're going to be joined by a waning crescent moon. A very thin moon will be right next to Jupiter and Mars, and that'll probably make a pretty photo. I'm going to see if I can capture that. And then finally on Saturday, really close to the sun, it's going to be hard to pick out, but Saturn and Mercury are passing close to each other. Mercury's going around behind the sun, and we're catching up to Saturn and pulling it into the night sky. So we'll have planets in the night sky before too long, or in the evening, I should say, before too long. That's coming up. Enjoy your week. Enjoy getting to know the stars. Again, I hope this is useful to everybody, and hope you can get out there. See you later. Bye.